Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name is Keiran Pedley. So it's not quite polling Christmas because that's kind of deferred to a general election, but it's got to be at least polling Easter or some other holiday, as we've had a series of elections overnight in the local elections, obviously a bunch of metro mayors and the Blackpool South by-election. Now, I'm joined to unpick what we know so far by one of my favourite people to talk about politics with, to keep the trend from last week, Holly.day. Holly, welcome.
Hi, Keiran. How's it going?
Good. Are you sufficiently caffeinated? I know I am. I'm about 3 deep in terms of teas at the moment, so I'm trying not to be too jittery. If I'm shaking when we're talking, then that's why. Don't be alarmed.
I was actually pretty disciplined last night compared to usual, I think, because of the time frames of some of the key things that I'm going to be looking out for. So, it was still a later night than it should have been and an earlier start than it should have been. But by no means running on fumes yet. But ask me again in a few hours' time.
Yeah, the day is young. So where shall we start, do you think?
I think maybe an overall look at how the evening's gone, evening and early hours actually have gone so far in terms of the local elections. We obviously had a number of seats being contested in councils across England that were last up in 2021, weren't they? Which was, as you'll have heard, lots of commentators doing their expectation management on the airwaves last night were saying it was kind of the peak of Boris Johnson. There was a vaccine bounce. They had really good results there. So potentially the Conservatives weren't expecting to do as well as that last night and were expecting some losses. I think I was hearing numbers banded around of somewhere between around 500 seat losses, and it looks that we're towards the lower ebb of what they were potentially expecting, I think. What's your take on how it's gone so far?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, obviously, as you say, we're about a third of the way through the council seats. And also, as we've said at the beginning, it's not just about the council seats with the metro mayors being declared over the weekend. And, that could change the dreaded word, the narrative, very quickly if something dramatic happens there. But I think in terms of council seats, yeah, I mean, it looks like at the lower end of what the Tories were hoping for. And I think the big picture really is that it just suggests that the opinion polls are broadly right. You would hope that as a pollster, obviously, but I was
going to say, pat on the back for us, not to do that too soon, but
well, no victory laps yet, right? Until you've won. Yeah. But no, I think that the point is that this time last year, everything sort of pointed towards Labour being roughly 20 points ahead nationally, and that's kind of where they are now. And again, if you try and take it a bit of a step back to the bigger picture, you're looking for that narrowing, right, aren't you? You're looking for that. Since the start of the year, we've been waiting for signs. Is it going to tighten? And there's really no signs of that. I think there were certain symbolic, individual councils. So Labour taking Hartlepool. Obviously, that was, I think it was 3 years ago that the Conservatives won the Hartlepool by-election, which was kind of very much the lowest ever of Keir Starmer's leadership. But also you've got the separate plot of Labour's vote share in areas that have large Muslim populations. They lost control of Oldham Council, primarily because of independence.
My actual council, Oldham, so that was from the local leafleting that we've had over the past few weeks and months. That was always going to be a close one. So I was keeping an eye on Oldham, given that's where I am.
I did not know that was your local council. So lots of Gaza messaging, or not really?
A fair amount. There's been an interesting political, personality-based dynamic, I'd say, here for the past few years because of certain individuals within the council. But there was a kind of high volume of leafleting and door knocking I was getting from independents, higher than I would normally have anticipated, I think. So that one wasn't as much of a surprise for me, given the local context, I don't think.
Yeah. So again, there's obviously. It's important to look at the individual councils and I think that there's some great analysis from sort of friend of the show, Will Jennings, who has talked about how the Conservatives seem to be doing a lot worse in areas where they had previously been doing better. So areas with sort of high percentage of Leave voters and so on, where obviously there is more vote for Labour to eat into because they did worse there historically. So I think in some ways that it's almost, no great surprise. Now, the Tories will say that we'll come to the by-election in a minute, but by-elections aren't always representative of what happens at general elections, and also local council elections are different beasts to our polling at Ipsos shows that people don't just vote on national issues, they vote on local issues too. And they'll point to that high watermark that you mentioned at the beginning in 2021, where, this is the height of the vaccine bounce. That's what we're broadly, not universally, but broadly comparing these results to. I think they're all fair points. I don't think it should be dismissed. But again, I think the big picture is there any sign of the Conservatives coming back from a very, very dire political situation? It doesn't seem like it, basically. I think it's probably in a nutshell.
And I think some of the results we saw in places like Rushmore in Hampshire, like switching to Labour, those are the sorts of places where you used to kind of, your ears pick up and you think, oh, hang on a minute. Okay, if the direction of travel is those sorts of places are switching from Conservative to Labour, there's something interesting going on. And also places like Thurrock, Redditch, Hartlepool, as you mentioned, they're places that if the Labour Party wanted to translate these sorts of victories into a general election win, or if they're hoping that the sort of polling that we're churning out is correct, they're the sorts of places that they're going to need to win in a general election, right? So the fact that they are winning those across the country in seats of all different types of makeups with the swings that we're seeing, I think they're probably going to be the happier of the two parties overnight. And with that in mind, I mean, Blackpool, we've got another record-breaking. Every single week we do this podcast and there's record-breaking polling, but
Rishi's roller coaster.
First one of the night. I think it's been an illuminating result, don't you think? We should stop. But in all seriousness, Blackpool was a big one overnight. That the swing that we've seen is the third biggest swing from Conservatives to Labour in kind of post-war history, and that's not to be sniffed at, right? I mean, we have been talking about these swings throughout, I think, 5 or 6 by-elections in this particular parliament, but the fact that that's the third biggest in history since the war, given all of the other stuff that was going on last night, that shouldn't be kind of overlooked. Quick quiz: what were the two swings higher than that? Can you name the constituencies? I didn't tell you I was going to do this beforehand. But...
that is harsh. Was it Wellingborough?
Yeah,
one of them. Yeah.
Wellingborough, 29%.
Ooh, Mid-Beds?
No.
I'm too distracted by my own home county. Go on then. What's the other one?
Dudley in 1994, 29% again. So. Not a long list of swings from Conservative to Labour that beat what happened overnight.
Well, I was 9 years old, so that's my excuse. But then, to be fair, I think you were a bit younger. So
I was 1, so I wasn't there for that one. This is based on research. As a researcher, this is based on research. But it does kind of illustrate quite how big that swing is. I think most people were expecting a swing. As I said earlier, there was a fair amount of expectation management from the Conservative side last night that they didn't think they were going to hold it, and that Labour thought they were going to win it. But to what extent they were expecting these numbers, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, we've become a bit desensitized to it, I think.
Yeah,
I think you're right. I mean, it's the fifth by-election this Parliament where there's been a 20-point swing or more, and I think before this Parliament, the last Labour win in a by-election gain was Corby in 2013. So we've gone from a situation where Labour haven't really been gaining in seats in by-elections at all to sort of consistent sort of 20, 25-point swings or more. So, I mean, from that perspective, and again, to put both sides to it, the Tories will say, well, of course, turnout's a lot lower. A lot of Conservative voters would have stayed at home. And I think there is truth in that. I mean, there will be some seats that Labour taken by-elections in this Parliament that they won't hold in a general election. But I think probably the other significant subplot to this is reform, which we'll sort of come to. I'm trying to remember now from my notes what their vote share was, just shy of 17%. So
16.9, yeah.
16.9. So which is their best performance in the by-election. Yep. And they were just shy of finishing second. And in terms of swing terms, maybe that doesn't matter so much, but it would have been a highly symbolic second place finish if they'd got that. I think they were 100 and something votes off doing so. And so I suppose I've recently tweeted or posted or whatever it is nowadays about this, but I've been someone that's been pretty, on this podcast and elsewhere, pretty sort of skeptical about reform. And do these votes really exist, or is there something? Are they being overstated by maybe overzealous Brexit panelists on online panels, or by the fact that quite a lot of pollsters prompt for them on their sort of first screen in a way that we don't and some others don't. And maybe that's a discussion for another day on sort of methodology there. But there was a bit of a sort of question mark about, are they being a bit overstated? And I still have that doubt or that concern or that question, I guess. But I think actually at this stage of the Parliament, what's probably more important is that their vote is real. There are real reform voters out there that are showing up. And I think the big question for me now is what happens at a general election, but what does Nigel Farage do? You know, he's made noises about making a comeback to frontline UK politics. I think that would be highly significant because he is one of the, our polling when Lee Anderson resigned showed he's in the top 4 of well-known frontline politicians today, behind Sunak's David Cameron and Starmer. And obviously, if you think about that 2019 Boris coalition, if you want to call it that, the two politicians that stand out as very popular amongst that group are Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. And so, obviously, I think him returning to frontline politics doesn't suddenly mean Reform are going to get loads of seats. But I think the damage that it could do, increasing damage that could do to the Conservative vote share, shouldn't be understated. So, I don't know what you think about Reform, Holly, and some of that, because I think this is kind of a key subplot, isn't it? Okay, everyone kind of thought Labour would win, and the swing is massive, and we shouldn't be desensitised to that. But obviously, there is this subplot of Reform.
Yeah, quite early on in the night, I was hearing rumblings that Reform genuinely thought they were going to take second place from the Conservatives, and the fact that they've just come shy by 100 or so votes, as you've said, tells me that maybe wasn't necessarily expectation management and more just expectation that they thought they genuinely might get there.
They were close, weren't they?
Probably squeaky bum time for some Conservatives in the room, wasn't it? I mean, a high of 16.9%, best performance in a by-election. They've probably got to take the positives away from that. I've seen Lee Anderson on the airwaves this morning saying Reform are here to stay. Same with Richard Tice. I think my question would be, yes, it's an excellent result and it's the best that they've had. But if you compare it back to the Brexit Party in the early 2010s and the sort of numbers that they were posting in by-elections, and also not to forget the European elections that we previously had when we were members of the European Union, that the Brexit Party won at one point, didn't they, in the early 2010s? They're not reaching the heady heights of that yet. And I'm wondering, as you said, what would the Nigel Farage effect be on this vote share? If Nigel Farage had been campaigning in Blackpool South, and this is hindsight and complete speculation, but I get the feeling that they would have come in second place. And it's therefore interesting to see that we're starting to hear murmurings about a potential return for him. We've said on this podcast before, I think it was myself and Cameron on the previous episode, that in this sort of territory, he's probably itching to get back. It's fruitful territory for him. In the national polls, we're seeing Reform within a few percentage points of the Conservative vote share, right? Within the margin of error with some pollsters. So he's potentially got to be weighing up the prospect of genuinely polling ahead of the Conservatives in vote intention over the next few months if he makes a comeback.
I mean, on the European elections, it was 2019, actually, where the Brexit Party came first, and he was the leader then. Pretty sure he was the leader then, or he was fronting that campaign anyway. So, and I think, frankly, if he was campaigning in Blackpool, they needed 100 extra votes to come second. So I think it's a pretty safe assumption that, and I think there is a wider point about how the media cover politics, which is that if Nigel Farage is the leader of Reform going into the next election, he will be covered a lot, right? I don't know what the deal will be with his show on GB News and so on. We'll park that one, but he will be someone that they follow around a lot. And I think to your point, I think there's a real vacuum at the moment on the Conservative side. It's the ground is so fertile for him at the moment, I think, because in 2015, David Cameron was in government seeking re-election. He promised the EU referendum. It was a very different environment. And I think now, when we look at our political pulse, I was looking at the numbers, I think it's in March, and you ask about favourability towards different politicians amongst 2019 Conservative voters. There were 7 7 politicians on the sort of conservative end of the scale, if you want to call it that. So basically 4 leading cabinet ministers: Sunak, Hunt, Cameron, and James Cleverly, and then obviously Nigel Farage, Lee Anderson, and Richard Tice. And of those, Farage is effectively joint first with Rishi Sunak in terms of favourability amongst 2019 Conservatives. So he really is like, if he was a Conservative MP, you'd be talking about him as a potential leadership candidate. So
sure.
That's not going to happen. I mean, I know there is sort of this fantasy politics of, oh, what if he joins the Tory party? I don't believe that for a second personally. But so point made. I think he's just very popular amongst those Leave voters. And I think this is part of the problem that people like me have always said about the Conservative strategy with Rwanda and their rhetoric on immigration. You're never going to outbid Nigel Farage on that. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have an offer on it. It's the most important issue to your voting coalition. It's an important issue to millions of people in the country. And, when net migration is the highest it's ever been, clearly there's going to be policy questions that come out of that. And I'm not going to, say what they should or shouldn't be, but it's clearly going to be a political issue. But they've got themselves into a problem, I think, the Conservatives, where they go next. But anyway, moving forward, it's not just about Blackpool, obviously. Sorry, Blackpool. There are other things going on. So what else are you looking out for next day or so, Holly?
It's sad to say, but I'm very excited for the mayoral results. This is kind of my jam. And I'm upset that I have to wait a number of days for it. I mean, in a general election, we have the exit poll. You stay up all night. It's coming in throughout the night. We've got to wait like 48 hours, I think, on the news.
Holly, you're amongst fellow political nerds. It's fine. It's a safe space.
On the news last night, someone was saying we might have to wait until like match of the day. Like, oh God, if the results clash with match of the day, I'm not entirely sure. Like, I'm going to have some weird split screen situation going on. But I think the mayoral result from a personal perspective in Greater Manchester will be interesting for me, given that's where I'm based. I think most people are expecting Andy Burnham to probably win that one relatively comfortably, as he has done previously. There's been a lot of chatter about 2 key races in the West Midlands and in Tees Valley, and they come a little bit earlier, I think. So we're expecting Tees Valley today on Friday, and that's where I think the Conservative Party are potentially hanging quite a few of their hopes, given the results overnight, that Ben Houchen, the incumbent there, will be able to hold on to the morality. I think he won 70% of the vote previously. So if he didn't hold on, that would be quite a seismic result. The West Midlands, I think, is going to be a lot closer. I've seen various polls over the past few weeks that are putting it kind of neck and neck, or Andy Street just ahead, or Richard Parker, the Labour candidate, just ahead. So that one's going to be fascinating. And I think the mood music following a couple of those key races is going to determine kind of the next steps for the parties and how they're framing how this weekend has gone for them, for sure.
So I think with Ben Houchen and Tees Valley, I think that is weapons grade expectation management to make holding that a sort of victory for the Conservatives, given the swing. As you say, 70% of the vote. I think there's something like 25% plus swing, or perhaps even more for Labour to take that. That to me, I can't really foresee a situation where there's a genuine concerted leadership challenge to Rishi Sunak, but that is the type of loss that I think could spark people into some Conservative MPs into sending letters in. West Midlands is a really interesting one because, as you say, the polling has been very tight. In a way, there isn't a result that would surprise, right? Because I think if Andy Street did hold on, you'd sort of understand it. But my gut says he won't. My gut says Labour take that, but just because of the sheer gravity of the shift against the Conservatives we're seeing elsewhere, just feels like, yes, he's got a bit of name recognition and a bit of goodwill that was shown in our mayoral polling that we released earlier this week. But I think I wouldn't exaggerate it either in terms of just like the strength of feeling. You look at the polling about Andy Burnham in Manchester, yes, obviously a very Labour city. That's a very different degree of sort of favourability or positive feeling than necessarily Andy Street's got. So, but again, you could sort of see how he retains, but I've got a feeling he won't. But Ben Houchen, I think that to me, I think he holds it, but if he doesn't, my God, that is really panic stations for the Conservatives. And then we've got London, of course, haven't we? Which is my neck of the woods.
Oh, yeah, sorry, forgot about London. My bad.
Well, as we know, it's very typical in politics for those Northerners just to forget about London, and poor old London gets left out.
I stretch as far as the West Midlands. Come on, give me some credit.
Yeah, it's always the North and Midlands just forgetting about poor old London. That's the way politics works, of course. But yeah, and I think with Sadiq Khan, obviously, it's almost a reverse of the Andy Street situation in the West Midlands. Sadiq Khan himself has very sort of polarizing favourability figures we've seen in our polling in London, and but he is seen as the more capable mayor over Susan Hall by a significant margin. There has been a swing towards Labour since 2019, and so you'd expect the wider political environment, the wider political context to keep him safe, as it were, in terms of being the mayor. But I think the unknown here is what is like the strength of feeling, the anti-Khan feeling, particularly in outer London, definitely exists. Already saw it in Uxbridge and Ruislip in the by-election sort of earlier this Parliament. So it's one of those where it's sort of ripe for a polling miss, frankly, in terms of there's this divisive candidate versus a national environment and which bit's going to win out. My instinct is that he'd still win comfortably. I think I said the other day, sort of 10 to 15 points. But, again, it's one of those where if it was a lot closer, like it was against Sean Bailey in the first round last time, you could see it. And I think we've got to remember, obviously, the electoral system's changed. So in the past, second preferences and so on were reallocated, and that would have made you a lot more confident if you're in the Khan campaign. Whereas now it's just he's effectively just got to lose on the first round. Susan Hall could be mayor with 35% of the vote or something. So interesting to watch. I still think he'll win. I suspect it might be a bit more comfortable, but hostage to fortune, of course, that should be out over the weekend.
Yeah, one final one I wanted to mention to not make any of the other mayors feel left out is somewhere like the East Midlands, where they're voting for the first time for a mayor. That's completely, unlike a lot of the elections we've had overnight, it's completely untainted by incumbency, by personalities, by having anything previously to go off. So that's the sort of place, I know it's a mayoral election and it's run at local election time, so turnout is going to suffer, but it could give us a bit more of an untainted view of like the general mood music, right? Compared to some of these other mayoralities where we've got, as you said, like bigger personalities. Too, right? North Yorkshire and York as well.
Rishi Sunak's backyard, and so I think I think as Philip Cowley was saying this, that these are places that in theory the lack of incumbent makes them a bit more representative of what you think would happen at a general election than necessarily with these. Even if Andy Street, for example, did win the West Midlands, I suppose the question is, what does that really tell you about the Conservatives' general election prospects? Doesn't mean they're going to like hold loads of Westminster seats in the West Midlands, does it? And so on. So anyway, there's going to be plenty to chew over in the coming days and weeks. And I think we're planning on doing a podcast, Holly, myself, you and Cameron, maybe an external guest next week to sort of go over what we know once everything is in, because acutely aware that the dreaded word, the narrative today, might be very, very different if, depending on what happens with the Metro mayors.
In the spirit of Blackpool, we shouldn't call it the narrative. We should call it like the roller coaster of electoral politics.
Yes, I didn't get. I tried to get a line in there about towering figures in politics, but I should have done that.
We're lacking in them. Week. That's the problem.
It's just too much caffeine. Just too much caffeine. Just forget. We'll
have slept by Tuesday for the deep dive for sure.
Exactly, but no, as ever, thank you, Holly. Always a pleasure, and thank you to listeners and viewers for tuning in again. Quick plug, if you haven't seen it already, we did a podcast earlier this week on Scotland with former Labour leader there, Kezia Dugdale, which I think was really interesting, particularly her thoughts on what Keir Starmer and Labour might do in office, assuming they get there, which is all indications are that they will, to solidify the union in the future. I've got a piece on that with Labour List next week as well, if I can plug that too. So do check out some of that as well. Completely different subject matter, but no less important, arguably more so if you're talking about the future of the UK. But for now, that's all we've got time for. Thanks as ever for listening. Please like and subscribe and check out future Ipsos Politics Talk podcasts next week and beyond.